Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today, whether you're watching it live or later. I'm Holly with Pine Cove, and I'm really excited about today's topic. For those of you that don't know me, I'm really passionate about cybersecurity, and today we have on Mark Sangster. He's from Adlumin, fantastic author and all-around cybersecurity guru. And we're really going to talk about 5 best practices for cybersecurity professionals to show value to their business leaders and really impress them. And this is a common problem we see across the industry. But without further ado, I'll let Mark, if you could just give a little bit of your background and introduce yourself and maybe even dive into the topic a little bit.
Yeah, of course, Holly. Thanks so much to you and to Pine Cove, for hosting, and then also, of course, to all of our attendees who join, live or later on demand. So my background, I'm a cybersecurity. I've been working in cybersecurity for about 25 plus years. I've authored a lot of research, including a book called No Safe Harbor on the topic, and it's actually kind of focused on what we're going to talk about today, which is, how do you talk about cybersecurity in terms of the business and risk and what those consequences or outcomes look like when you're dealing with non-technical, leaders like CFOs and CEOs. And, it's, of course, this is something, you can turn into a book or probably a collection of books. But, in this next 20, 30 minutes, we're going to try and hit on sort of what are some of the top 5 things that you can do, which kind of translate to some of the typical mistakes or, tripping points that I see happen in organizations.
And really, the first best practice is speaking their language. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah. So, a lot of times, in fact, I was just talking to an organization we work with, and, we'll be briefing their board members in a few weeks or so. And, they were saying, look, we love a lot of your threat intelligence. We love a lot of this information. But, the problem is it's super technical. And as soon as you start getting into, screen captures and code snippets and things like that, they don't know where you're going. And I always joke about, if your tech people start off talking about, Cobalt Strike on a domain controller, you're in big trouble, because those execs don't know what the heck you're talking about, right? So it is important to use a vocabulary that you share, right? And I summarize this as IT security or cybersecurity is not an IT problem to solve. It is a business risk to manage. So when you talk about these things, when you talk about cybersecurity controls or threats or the threat actors or the methods they might use or vulnerabilities or whatever it might be, give them the why, right? Not the what and the how. Give them the why, right? So talk about it in terms of business risk, right? So that could be losses stemming from operational outages or ransomware payments or whatever. Reputational risk. I think we all intuitively understand that one, right? I mean, what kind of business will we lose in the future? Or worst case, depending on what we do, will be sanctions from working in a specific industries. And then the compliance side as well, right? Which is obviously, the investigations, audits, settlements, payment, penalties, things that you may have to deal with. The best way I suggest learning about this and understanding cybersecurity in terms of fiduciary risk is to read the Cyber Risk Handbook from an organization called the National Association of Corporate Directors. They have this sort of 50, 60 page PDF that does a really good job of talking about fiscal and fiduciary care, talking about it in terms of sort of like 5 or 6 guiding points, and sort of talks about, how do I communicate with my executives? And from an executive perspective, what questions do they need to ask of the security team? And looking at the answers they get, determine whether or not their business is safe or whether or not they have gaps. And, and that's one of the places where I've spent a lot of time doing these kind of audits and tabletop exercises and briefings. But at Adlumin, we also, one of the things we do in our, in our security operations platform is to provide automatic reporting that is for the exec, right? So the less technical kind of stuff that gives them sort of the trends and the top threats and so on, to give them a feel for what the security posture of the organization looks like.
I think that's huge. If we can help automate that for security professionals, because now we're asking them to not only be, knowledgeable about their industry, actually implement the security practices, watch over them, and then actually communicate that. That's huge. That automation is huge. But I know you briefly touched on business risk. Words tripping over themselves today. Can you just help define that risk? Because business risk and cyber risk is very different, but there's a lot of overlap.
No, you're totally right. I mean, I think executives are used to other forms of risk, things like economic risk, natural disasters, massive outages, like a power failure, or, when Hurricane Sandy struck in New York, for example, and it shut down, lower Manhattan and New Jersey and so on, and suddenly banking ground to a halt. So they've experienced those kind of things. But from a cyber risk perspective, if they're very unlucky, they have experienced it firsthand, or they read about it in the headlines. And I think the problem is they all tend to over-rotate to the threat actors, right? To the bad guys, these ransomware groups, state-sponsored actors, what's going on in the Ukraine right now, Chinese or Iranian hacktivists and so on, right? And that's what they think of. And that's just one piece of the triad, right? Yes, there are the external threats and internal threats, for that matter, that face your organization. But there's the vulnerabilities or the exposures, and those, they come in all sorts of forms, right? That might be the industries that you participate in, therefore the data that you manage and the typical threats that go along with those, right? Robbers rob banks because that's where the money is. The type of technology that you use. So, are you cloud or on premises or hybrid? Do you have industrial IoT controls in place? So think about a healthcare facility with patient monitoring, patient wearable devices, or, automated things like pharmaceutical dispensaries, things like that. And then you have your obligations. And those come from many different factors, right? And everyone, again, kind of focuses on the compliance or the regulatory side of that. And they're right? Of course, right? That tends to be the driver in these cases. But your obligations come from other places, right? It's the accountability to your investors and your employees, the contractual obligations that you put in place with your customers. And then, of course, you as a vendor and your vendors, right? That whole supply chain risk piece. So it's really understanding, what are you obligated to? And that may be partially, like I said, you have regulators that put guardrails in place, but there's other factors that go into that. And I always kind of joke with that sometimes, where I say, when I do tabletops and I talk about a breach scenario or a customer's information has been exposed from a client or whatever it is, and I kind of say, do we notify the client or do we notify other clients? And you'll get a lot of humming and hawing and a lot of debate. And it's like, read the contract, man. Like, did you say you'll tell them? Well, that's your starting point. Are there governance above that, and so on? So think about it from that perspective. Think about the liability, right? And I've hit on some of these, not just the regulators, but insurance. If you were to make a claim, would it be successful? Can you prove duty of care? Have you written, airtight contracts? So not just the contract with your customers and what you have to do, but also, like I said, with your suppliers and your vendors, to make sure in these situations, roles and responsibilities, you divided or division of duty, and notification, right? So, and that really all boils down to three major things that I talk about with risk. One is an appetite. What's the limit? What would you be willing to accept as a business? What would be game ending or, an extinction level event? What kind of tolerances do you put in place? So specific boundaries, how much you're willing to spend or lose, how much time you can have downtime from critical business systems, right? And then whatever residual risk is there because you can't avoid it, what are you going to do to offset or mitigate it? Maybe that's insurance or, more technology spend, backups, et cetera. So really talk about it in those terms. And now you've got their attention rather than saying, look, I need endpoint and here's why, because that doesn't always resonate.
For sure. Looking at the next step, what happens in case of that event? Where are we at then? Third best practice is test and train. So starting with preparation, I'm assuming, but can you just dive into that? Because there's a lot to unpack with testing and training.
Yeah, 100%, right? There's, you'll hear an expression in the military or law enforcement, which will be like right of boom or left of boom. And what they're talking about is, before the major incident, the crime is committed or whatever it might be, left of boom is everything that precedes it. And right, of course, is everything that follows it. And so it is about testing and training. And a friend and colleague of mine, he actually used to be an NFL quarterback way back in the day. And one day we were talking and he said, you don't practice until you get it right. You practice until you can't get it wrong. And the subtleties that we discussed there is really about understanding what the risks look like, understanding how they're going to manifest when they show up in your inbox or they show up, at your front door or whatever it might be. And then taking those likely scenarios, right, building those out and engaging all facets of the business. because a cyber incident or a data breach is much more broad than you think. It's not a technical problem. You may have board members that have to be notified and make approval of major decisions. You have executives that are leading there and have to, make those decisions. For example, if your system was infected badly and you were like, well, we got to shut everything down, and this is now going to cause a public outage, that's probably not an IT person's decision to make. You want the business to make those kind of decisions. You also have to look at, we just talked about it, determine your obligations. So when these things happen, do I have to notify a customer? Do I have to notify a regulator? If I were to do so, how do I speed dial the FBI or law enforcement? Who do I even contact? So figuring that stuff out, being on a first name basis with these individuals, having them come in. And I know a lot of people are hesitant with regulators, and I understand that. But working with law enforcement or breach coach lawyers and incident response firms, having them on retainer, they'll come in and help you prep and train so that when it happens, you're not calling 1-800-FBI, you're calling, Frances, and she works in the local, FBI office, knows about cyber risk, knows who you are, and already has one foot in the door, right? Understands it. And the last piece I'm going to say with that, and, we don't have a lot of time here, is simulate uncertainty. When you do your training, right? When you practice incident responses, as an example, there's another military term called VUCA: volatility, uncertainty, chaos, and ambiguity. And that's what they use to try and simulate, the fog of war, right? To put stress on you that you would, of course, in a real situation have, like fear and anxiety and so on. Well, frankly, when you deal with an incident, okay, you may not be being shot at, I will agree. However, there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of anxiety and a lot of heightened emotions that go on during these incidents because they affect people's lives. They affect the likelihood of the survival of the business and so on, right? So there's a massive impact. So you want to simulate that. You want to try and create a bit of tension in the room, right? Because when everyone sits there very calmly sipping their coffee or whatever it is, it's just not the same and they don't take it seriously. But when you start throwing red herrings at them, or you make radical changes, and so they're halfway down the path and they think they're in a good state, and then you throw something out at them that knocks them off course and now start again, that's what you're trying to do, right? Is kind of create that frustration. And I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but it's not, because that's exactly what you're going to find when you're in a real world situation. So it's best to be as prepped as you can and hope that muscle memory kind of kicks in at the moment when you best need it, right? Or when you most need it, because that's the way you're going to get through this thing. And that's how you're going to reduce the risk of the likelihood of a significant disruption or material incident that affects your business.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I mean, we all have incident plans, but actually putting those to practice. It's more than just, a fish test that gets sent to all of your employees' emails. It's so much bigger than that. It's about simulating those real world scenarios.
Yeah, you know what? In fact, this morning I was talking to somebody about, of course, with that. Now we'll see if this happens in the U.S., but the impending government shutdown, as they can't get a funding bill in place. Well, if that were to occur, as an example, about 80% of a lot of cybersecurity organizations that are out there or 80% of those workers will be furloughed, right? So that includes DHS, right? Homeland Security, includes CISA, which is kind of the public arm of DHS. And so, these are the times where you're going to have skeleton staff. You're not going to get the kind of support and intelligence that you were getting from those groups. And it's also in that chaos that criminals like to strike, right? They know you're weak and you're down, they're going to kick you. So be prepared. So, when you're doing your testing, throw things out that like a notice from CISA about some event with a link to log in to get the information and see if people click, right? See if they break kind of policy and the standard operating procedures. Things like that. It sounds a little mean, and it is. However, again, this is what criminals do, right? So you're rather to have somebody give you, you're rather, how do you put it? If you're boxing, you'd rather have a friendly opponent in the ring to practice, right? As you're sparring. And it's the same concept. You want to do that because otherwise those bad guys don't pull punches, man. They want to hurt. And so you're better to be prepared for it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that you kind of touched on the government shutdown. I mean, all these little things that we normally don't think about in our day to day, but how it can severely impact, a business's cybersecurity posture. And if we could bring that into our preparation and planning. Okay,
Yeah,
but now we're kind of going on to the next step, right? Detect and containing threats. I don't even know where to begin to start with that because there's so much involved in detecting and then containing. How do we unpack that?
Yeah, so you're right. There's lots of ways to slice and dice. And in fact, if we look at, say regulatory frameworks or NIST or, these standards, a lot of times they're very what I call aspirational, right? Which means they sort of talk about what you need to do. You need to be able to continuously monitor your environment looking for unauthorized activity. But they're not prescriptive, right? That's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum where it says you're going to use this tool. It has to do, X, Y, and Z, and it has a lot more kind of details to it. And so, there are lots of different ways that we can slice and dice here. But the reality is, looking at the investigations we've gone through and looking at some of the work that our founders did when they worked for CrowdStrike and the NSA, and they dealt with major cases like the DNC, and the Joint Chiefs data breaches and, things like Colonial Pipeline and JBS Foods and so on, right? These mega kind of milestones. It all comes down to very common factors, right? Things like poor password hygiene, lack of multi-factor authentication, unprotected remote connections, things not being segmented, and so on. So there's a lot of things that we can do there to make sure that we segment our network. We use least privilege, to limit those that can access it. We provide awareness training, like we've already touched on, endpoint controls to make sure that we can see what's kind of happening at the so-called new perimeter, right? I mean, reality is now we don't have one, on-premises perimeter. Now we have thousands, if not an infinite number of little micro ones. And when you do that, what you're going to find is those common factors bubble up, like I said. And a lot of these things can be stopped. Impossible travel, where you have logged in, simultaneously from Germany and from Los Angeles, and you did it, or you did it within an hour of each other. It is not possible to fly there unless you have teleportation. So those kind of things are giveaways that an account's been compromised. Geolocation, odd times of day, bandwidth spikes, like we saw with the Target hack. Things like unauthorized remote access, where suddenly you're seeing remote connections come in from different places, and they're trying to access critical systems, like say the Active Directory, and they're creating new accounts, but you can't correlate to new employee hires, things like that. And so what this really is about is a couple of things. Number one, you have to have that detection capability, a system that can pull from your entire environment, right? So like I've just hit on a bunch of things, network and perimeter and endpoint and cloud and IoT and users and accounts and so on. You then have to be able to correlate that information. And one of the big challenges we see is that just generates more and more data, right? The more tech we throw on, the more logs and alerts and detections and things that get thrown back at us. And so a lot of companies have invested in artificial intelligence and machine learning, like large learning models, to sift through that and kind of figure out what's normal and what's suspicious and kick out all the most likely normal things as false positives. So I'm kind of reducing the waste load there and allowing you to focus on the real signals that matter, right? And then also adding what I call sort of context relevance. So things like UEBA, which is user and entity behavior analytics. These are tools that don't look at the separate pieces, not just your firewall for your network traffic and your email filters for your email and your endpoint looking at your endpoint. Now we're looking at what user, where a user comes in from, when they do it, how they do it, what they connect to, what their devices start doing on the environment, what data storage or systems they start connecting to. And all of those things give us a good shot at determining a baseline, right? Measuring a baseline going, this is what Mark does on a daily basis, on an average day. When Mark starts doing weird things like logging at the wrong time from an odd place, starts accessing systems he doesn't normally, that's most likely suspicious. That indicates there's a compromised account. And that's where, if you can detect those things, you then have the next step, which is containing it, right? And you have to contain or have the ability to contain across all of those. So, can I block the user's access? Can I disable their account or, even force an MFA token reset? Can I, block remote access? Can I isolate an endpoint that's been infected? Can I block a system that's infected from communicating with other systems? And can I stop executables or, processes that run on devices? So maybe I don't want to shut down the major device itself, because let's say it's a PACS server for a medical imaging suite. I don't want to put all those patients out, but I see it trying to run an executable that doesn't make any sense for what its job is. So I'm just going to kill that, right? That's really what it's about. And the faster you do that, the less it's going to cost you, right? It's like cleaning up spilled milk. But if it's allowed to, to move through your environment and to spread, that's where it becomes a lot more dangerous, and that's where it's a lot more costly to eradicate.
Definitely. Yeah, that's, so important. stopping it, not just detecting, but stopping containing those threats so then it doesn't spread.
Right.
And the last best practice is prove your value. This is one of my favorites. It's how do security professionals do that to business leaders? Because they know what they're doing. They understand what they're doing. They're detecting containing threats, they're testing and training, but really, how do they prove that value?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the toughest things because first we've already talked about the fact that they don't necessarily have the technical understanding to appreciate the nuances, right? And that's kind of
Definitely.
true. But I think some of this comes back to fundamental dashboarding, right? Can you track things like regulatory performance? Are you meeting those compliance standards you have to meet, or are there violations in place? And trending that. What is your history? Is that improving, or is it getting worse, right? Other regulatory factors. Peer comparisons. That's a huge one that I see companies use a lot, right? Which is that, hey, we're spending this, and here's the number of attacks we're seeing. Here's the vulnerabilities that we're closing, things like that. And how do we compare to our average, player, bank? If we're a community bank, how do we compare to other banks? If we're a community hospital, how do we compare to other hospitals of our size? That's a good indicator of, are you spending, too little, just enough, or too much? And are you getting the results from those things, right? Are you getting back the ROI of what you paid for? And of course, the operation side. I think one of the big things, though, is that a lot of technical practitioners fall to numbers. We did this number of scans, we ran this penetration test, and we got these results. We patched X number of systems. And I don't think that's relevant. I think what's more important is to put almost like a service level agreement or an SLA on that to say, you know what, we've identified critical patches have to occur within X time. They have to occur within 4 hours, right? High risk ones need to occur within 10 hours and, or 1 day or whatever it is. And then you can say, not only are you dealing with the number of things you're patching within the SLA, but you can talk about, are you meeting it or are you not meeting it? Right. And how is that trending? And that starts to give them the idea of, we've established a risk boundary, and are you meeting it or not? So even though you patch 10,000 systems, I don't know what that means. Is that good or bad? I'm trying to give them a context to tell them if it's good or bad. And one of the best models that I use here too is there's a training or learning model called Kirkpatrick's model. And it breaks measurement or metrics into 4 broad buckets. Number 1 is reaction. And that's the basic stuff, right? That's the smiley sheet. Did you like the instructor? Was the course fun? Do you like the animations, the gamification, whatever the heck it is, right? Then there's the learning pieces. Those are the things like the metrics that you would pull out of, let's say, awareness training, right? How many people took the test? What was the average score? When you do testing, what were the click-through rates, credential surrender rates, things like that. And again, you want to trend those. And they're interesting. That's like the equivalent of, like I said, how many things did we patch, right? The behavioral measures as the third, that's where we get interesting, right? That's where we start to say, are we changing people's behaviors? Are we patching within that SLA? Are we finding that our surrender of information is starting to go down? Are we seeing people not click on things that they shouldn't, or following policies and not breaking them? For example, they have a file size that's too big to email, and they actually go to the company and say, how can I transfer this to a customer or something, without, say, going and using their own personal box or Dropbox or whatever file sharing system that they want to use. It's a violation. And then ultimately the outcomes, right? The outcomes are the big one. That's are the costs for IT going down? Are we, the nuisance things, password resets, having to rebuild systems that were infected, things like that. Are we losing less to business email compromise? Are we not paying ransoms? You can kind of compare that over time, because that's ultimately what matters to an executive, right? Is, what is the business outcome? How does our reputation, how's it doing in the marketplace? Are we in good stead, or has it been affected? And I think that's what matters. So it's like, think about the end state, the business outcome kind of metrics. That's how you're going to prove your value. That's how you're going to show, hey, look, we invested in endpoint technology, and not only did it stop a whole bunch of things, that's kind of like reaction or learning, but here's the expenses we've seen go down from that. So we paid, $10 a license for this thing, but we're seeing a $50 per user savings overall, or, when we average it out, because we've got these tools in place, and they're blocking attacks that previously were getting through.
Yeah, that's huge. I think overall, we touched on so much today in such a short period of time, but they're all so important to security professionals, even within our internal teams, right? Our own security professionals in Adlumin and Pine Cove. But overall, speak the language, right? Understand business risk, test and train, and really go beyond just creating an incident plan and dive into those nuances. Detect and contain threats and prove your worth. Because it's not enough to really just show, oh, yep, I stopped 10,000 or I did 10,000 patches. Well, what does that mean exactly? Especially to an executive that has never even heard of a patch except, what's on their elbow, or, when
That's
they had
right.
a patch on their jeans in middle school. But
Exactly.
thank you so much, Mark. This was super informative. I really enjoyed this. If anybody has any questions, comments, you can still comment in the section below, even after this is stopped showing live. We really encourage questions and anybody to follow up. If you want to hop on a call, hop on any sort of conversation with us, feel free. You can reach us straight through the social media, through an email, sales@pinecc.com, going to either of our websites, Adlumin or pinecc.com. And we really encourage you all to do that. But we hope everyone has a good rest of their day.
Yeah, and you can absolutely, reach out, because we can give you a demo if you'd like to understand more, or even through Pine Cove, we do a free proof of value. So you can actually run the system inside your own environment and, kind of sandbox with your own data and really find out what's going on within your network.
For sure. Well, thank you so much, Mark.
Hey, my pleasure.